Gang, we are talking about contrast, from the traditional understanding in composition / visual pool with a few different curveballs thrown in, all the way through to the story and the mood and the vibe of the image and how contrast affects it all. We're going to be flowing from the overlooked fundamentals to the high level professional concept and ideas, from what it is, how do the greats use it, and how we can practice with it so we can be the best photographers we can be. If you don't know who I am JP. I am a full-time professional photographer trusted by global brands to capture their visions, and I make videos about being the mentor that I wish I had earlier in my journey. So let's set the foundation to then build out from this. Contrast is the difference between opposing elements that are close together within our frame. The greater the difference between these two different elements, the greater the contrast. So, why as photographers should we care? Well, when we look at a photo, we could be looking anywhere, right? But isn't it weird that you and me, we tend to look at the same thing first? That thing that we are looking at has what's known as the greatest visual pull, aka it's the most eye-catching thing in the image. And more often than not, it's contrast that's pulling our eye towards where the photographer wants us to look. And yes, there are obviously going to be other things at play, but contrast really is king in this situation when it comes to a visual pull. And I bet you didn't think that in this very video that you are watching, there are 3 different types of contrast that are making me stand out from the background. So, what are they? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most likely you use this every day without even realizing. And we are talking about detail contrast. So if we use a wide aperture or portrait mode on our phones, we are creating a difference in detail between our subject and the background. And our eyes are naturally drawn to these areas of high detail. Why is that? Well, this kind of seems to affect or mimic our eyes, because in reality, when we look at things, such a tiny part of our vision is actually in focus, and our eyes compensate for this by making these super fast eye movements called saccades all over the place, so it makes it feel like everything that we're looking at is in focus. But we shouldn't become reliant on this as our only form of contrast, because it's more dependent on our kit than our skills as a creative. And one type of contrast that we can control is the iconic, most widely understood form of contrast, probably due to the Lightroom slider, is the almighty tonal contrast. Simply, this is the difference between the lightest and darkest parts of our frame. And high tonal contrast will have sharp differences between these light areas and these dark areas. So, why, when we look at this diagram, this graphic, why do you look at this circle rather than this circle? It's tonal contrast at play. The colours are all the same, just this circle at the bottom is brighter than the circle at the top, and compared to the background, it has a bigger difference, so you look at it first. And when we increase the value in the Lightroom slider, its main function is to make the lights lighter and the darks darker. But what's so interesting about this is that our perception of contrast changes as elements get closer together. As the proximity between bright areas and dark areas get closer, this increases the contrast and creates more visual pull. And the same can be said for color contrast. Color contrast is the difference between color hues. The colors on the opposing sides of the color wheel have the greatest color contrast, aka greatest visual pull. And do you remember that craze when everything was teal and orange? Those colors have a high color contrast. And plus, naturally, there's loads of blue in the sky, and our skin color is quite orangey, so naturally there's lots of these colors in our images. And this form of contrast usually works very well when there is a limited color palette, which then emphasizes the color differences. So check out this image. Everything in this frame is on the reddish side of the color wheel. There's a red wall, there's 4 people with ginger hair, and everyone's wearing brown clothes. It's all the same, it's all part of that narrow band of the color wheel. And then we've got this one person who is wearing pink, which is subtly different and creates a subtle color contrast. But then we've got their bright blue hair. There is no way that when we look at this image, the first thing we look at is anything other than her hair, before then exploring the rest of the image. I find that so fascinating, and if you found this interesting, give this video a little like and subscribe if you'd like to see a little bit more. So how do great photographers use contrast? Well, the most obvious example is the focal point creation. A good photographer will use detail, color, and tonal contrast to draw the viewer's eye to a specific subject. Take these iconic sports photos. My favorites are these shots by Neil Leafer. Often, our subject is illuminated against a dark background, therefore creating color contrast. And what's also mega about these old photos that we can't create anymore is this blue haze in the background, which came from everyone smoking inside. And this haze lowers the contrast in the background, adding or creating that difference in tonal contrast that makes our subject stand out. But it also creates a color contrast. And to nerd out a little bit for a minute here, due to physics that I'm not going to go into, things further away are bluer than close things. And so our subjects that are closer to the camera look warmer and therefore create a subtle color contrast between them and the background, which is sick, right? And plus, because Neil is a fantastic photographer, he doesn't miss focus, and so we get that detail contrast too. And so now that our images have got focus, we've now got to create visual balance, because we don't just want our viewer to look at the subject and go, cool, I'm done, we can move on. We want them to look around the frame, to not get bored, to want to stick around and to really enjoy the image. And so a skillful photographer will create a hierarchy of subjects, gradually reducing the contrast as you flow through them, so the viewer stays engaged and keeps looking around the frame. And not only that, contrast has these subtle effects too, that not many photographers consider. And to be completely honest, I used to have no idea about this, and you can tell when you look at my images. As soon as I heard someone mention this in a passing video, I was like, oh my god, this is such a game changer. So contrast affects our perception of the mood of the image, which sounds obvious, but it's subtle. See, high contrast is punchy, it's high tension, it's energetic, it's dramatic, whereas low contrast, it's kind of calm, it's kind of soft, kind of nostalgic, spacious. And a good photographer will understand the mood and the feeling of the image, and then we'll double down on this and really use it to emphasize the vibe. And now that we're starting to get into more kind of big brain stuff, a little bit more esoteric, there's another super easy way that we can level up our images. Because many photographers, when starting out, will shoot a single subject in their frame, blasting them with a low f-stop, which, let's be real, just isn't that engaging. What in the environment can we use to create contrast? Where could we create perhaps a juxtaposition? This could be new versus old, rich versus poor, James Popsey's human nature, or human versus nature. By having multiple elements or subjects in the frame, we can encourage the viewer to compare and contrast our subject with everything else in the background. And we can start to get our viewer to consider a deeper meaning within our image. And although this is only a very small element of story, which if you want to learn more about, you can check out my book, Street Tools, this is the perfect way to start leveling up our work as a photographer. So how can we practice and use contrast to our advantage to help improve our images and to be better photographers? Well, one of my favorite ideas that I always rabbit on about is light on dark, dark on light. When we've found a subject or an environment we like, consider if they have whether they're a bright or a dark subject, and then place them on the opposing background. The better at this we get, I promise you, the better image we will get. period, because we are emphasizing the contrast. We're making our subject, the thing we want our viewer to look at, to naturally stand out against the background. And then in post-production, we have an opportunity to adapt our images. And I hate it when photographers are like, post-processing isn't real photography. Yes, it is. And all the old boy greats did it, so can we. Here is how we can use contrast to enhance our images. And it requires thought on each and every single different image. What is the mood or the vibe that we are creating? Is it a soft and tranquil scene? In which case, let's consider lowering the overall contrast to feel peaceful. If it's super dramatic and we want it to feel punchier, try adding in more contrast. And then to get a little bit more granular, we can add contrast to particular areas of our images, depending on where we want our viewer to look first. And I really like to use radial filters with a really soft feathering, because it's a subtle way to focus the viewer on what I want them to look at. But what's important is to have nuance. And this is where our taste really starts to get developed, right? We don't want to be slapping up our contrast to 100, because this will just make our images feel unrefined. It feels less considered. And it's all about really developing the harmony of the image to really understand it. And this is something that takes a long time to refine and to develop. So get feedback, ask great photographers what they think about your images. And through practice, we will all get better and we will all develop this skill. And if you enjoyed this video, chances are you're also going to enjoy this one. And so until next time, see you on the street. Peace.